I would love for you to state your name and tell us what seat you're running for, and then a little bit about the district that you're going to represent.
Okay, good. All right, my name is Colin Jack, and I'm running for House District 73. I am currently the representative-elect for this seat, in that I will be finishing the rest of this year for Travis Siegmiller, who has resigned from the seat. And the currently 62, next year will be 73, is the southeast side of St. George, mostly in Little Valley, most of the city of Washington, and on up into Leeds. So all here in Washington County, it encompasses about 25% of the county, or 25% of the population in the county. It's a relatively small area just because it's the most densely populated. I'm an electrical engineer. I've been electrical engineer for 35 years. I work in the power sector, and I've worked for the last 28 years for Dixie Power here in St. George. And Dixie Power is a rural electric cooperative, and we serve in northern Arizona in Mojave County, in Washington County, south of the Virgin River, in Iron County, kind of west of Irontown, and in East Millard County. So that's where I work, and that's my career. So when we talk about technology, I'm an electrical engineer, so I like technology.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful to understand. And you just answered my next question. Tell us, your background. But Utah is known for having one of the best economies in the nation. What gets you excited about the economy in Utah, and what are your concerns with that as well?
Yeah, okay. So what gets me excited about the economy is the fact that Utah is such a desirable place to live that we attract a lot of talent. And with that talent comes a lot of innovation. I know innovators work hard. Here at Dixie Power, we partner with Innovation Plaza at Dixie State University, now Utah Tech University. But and when they're trying to develop power related projects, we help them out and help them with their pilot projects and their proof of concept. So I'm excited about the innovation we see. I think one of the things that really helps us in our economy here in Utah is we have very affordable energy relative to the rest of the country. And conversely, that's also one of the things that most concerns me, is having our energy security. I feel like there are a lot of threats to our energy security here in the West. And even though Utah is a net exporter of energy, we are no less under threat from these external forces. And that's really one of the things that got me involved in, say, the political process. 15 years ago, I became a delegate, and I've been working in the Republican Party for 15 years, was to bring that energy expertise into these political conversations, because I feel like a lot of the politicians and regulators who were threatening our energy security probably just didn't know better. And so I've been working on that, and now this year moved into the candidate realm, which as an electrical engineer is way outside my comfort zone, but willing to do that work for the benefit of my area, the county, and for the state.
Perfect. So when you talk about the external threats, could you be a little bit more specific what you mean? That you mentioned regulation. Are there any other external threats that you're concerned about?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, we could talk for a long time on that subject. But um, in 2020, uh, because of external pressures, and a lot of them we see here in the West come out of California, uh, 6,000 megawatts of baseload generating plants were demolished. They were coal, natural gas, and nuclear.
Mhm.
And the reason baseload is important is because when you flip the light switch any time of day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you expect the lights to come on. And it's the
Right.
base load generators who can do that. And so when they demolish these 6,000 megawatts, and you're wondering, well, how much is that? That would have been enough to power the entire state of Utah.
Hmm.
So they demolished enough power plants to power the entire state of Utah. And then immediately in summer of 2020, California found themselves short of resource and went into rolling blackouts. And so then we saw the same thing in our neighboring region. We're not connected to Texas. In fact, no one is connected to Texas.
Mhm.
But in 2021, Texas fell victim to their premature demolition of coal, gas, and nuclear. And in February of 2021, they had the big freeze, and they didn't have the base load resource to carry them over through the weather they had, and 700 people died because of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so here in Utah, we see continued pressures, both from lawmakers, and I can talk about the 5 bills that we managed to kill in committee this year in 2022, which were proposed, regulators, and also the threats from large, well-funded, huge corporations who manage our retirement assets and who manage our insurance companies, have put their own agenda with regard to what they feel is important with regard to environment and social justice and governance. And this ESG is also part of what has pressured the demolition of these power plants. And so I mentioned the 6,000 megawatts in 2020. They've actually scheduled 4 times that many demolitions between 2020 and 2030, which already the North American Electric Reliability Council is sending out alerts for this summer saying that the entire United States is going to be short of generating capacity through summer of 22. And we
So
don't want that to hit us here in Utah.
sure, absolutely. I think it's really helpful to understand that background knowledge. Maybe a dumb question, but we have a growing population in Utah,
Right.
so it's certainly not that we're using less power. Is
Absolutely.
this being supplemented through, like solar? Is that why there's the justification for demolition?
Well, so yes, absolutely. That is what they are using as a justification for demolishing these baseload plants. They're saying, oh,
Mm-hmm.
well, I'm replacing them one for one with solar or wind. But
Uh-huh.
what they either don't know or what they are choosing to ignore is that solar and wind are weather dependent intermittent resources which generate when they want to and not when the customer demands it.
Mm.
So they are not baseload units. A baseload unit will generate 98% of the time. You take some time out for maintenance, but these intermittent resources will generate 20% of the time and not the 20% of the time you need them, which is why California found themselves in rolling blackouts, and which is why Texas found themselves in
Sure.
a big blackout, is because when you need it, intermittent resources are not there.
Right, right. Okay, that's helpful to
And
understand.
that's why an electrical power engineer such as myself
Mhm. Mhm.
needs to be on the state legislature
Mm-hmm.
to help bring some of this laws of physics into the equation so that
Right.
we can have electricity, because without energy, none of our technology works.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're very dependent on it. You brought up ESG, so these social credit scores, and that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. There's been a lot of discussion about ESGs, and what do you think the legislature's role is with ESGs?
Well, I think ESG is 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 something that we need to resist here in Utah. I think they're coming from external pressures, either from people who don't understand the laws of physics, or they are deliberately sabotaging our economy. And so, like the state treasurer, Marlo Oaks, has been pushing back on that. If you go to his article in Bloomberg News on the subject a
Hmm.
couple of weeks ago, I was also interviewed by Bloomberg News. I was in the last 3 paragraphs of that article. And I think the state legislature should push back on those. And if we have insurance companies, for example, there's Liberty Mutual and AIG who refuse to insure passenger automobiles for companies like Dixie Power, who sell coal-fired power. And, in Utah, most of our power comes from coal, which is why our power is so inexpensive and so reliable. I think if companies will refuse to insure companies like Dixie Power or Deseret Power or other utilities, then I think maybe they ought not be licensed in the state of Utah.
So, in a nutshell, you do believe that the legislature should regulate ESGs when it comes to private businesses. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think when private businesses affect the entire economy of the state of Utah,
Hmm.
and especially businesses that are managing, there's only like 2 big companies that manage all of our retirement portfolios. Those kind of companies need to be regulated, if that's the right word, but they need to be moderated by the legislature to let them know that that's not okay, that they can't raise rates and raise costs to the average Utahns and harm our business. We find if Standard & Poor's puts an ESG score on Utah and marks us down because we have coal-fired electricity in Utah, I think that's not okay, because that raises the cost of everyone to do business. And it is a deliberate attempt to shift wealth and capital from a state who is working and producing, and shift that to states who are not working and producing. And I think that's not okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, the biggest things that we ran a survey last year. We surveyed thousands of tech employees throughout the state, and overwhelmingly, it didn't matter what role you were in, how long you had lived in Utah, lifelong Utah to being here less than 5 years. It didn't matter where in the state you were located. Um, Overwhelmingly, the number one concern about living in Utah was air quality. So tell me, do you think that the state should be doing more or less? What do you think the state should be doing when it comes to air quality?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and it's a very big issue, air quality.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And what I see is the state routinely tackles the easy but the wrong targets.
Mm.
So the biggest problem with air quality, say like up on the Wasatch Front,
Yeah.
are automobiles and tailpipe emissions. But targeting automobiles is a huge target and an undesirable target because it affects everyone.
Right.
And so they go after things like coal-fired plants, which have no contribution to air quality
Mm.
or no adverse contribution to air quality. And so they do things that maybe sound good on the surface, but accomplish nothing. And here in Washington County, we have air quality problems, and almost all of it is dust, from wind and from construction. And so what are we going to do about the dust down here? Well, I mean, there are rules about keeping the construction sites watered to keep the dust down. And I think those are unevenly enforced. And some of our worst air quality days are when they're doing controlled burns on the Kaibab forest, which, I mean, I understand they need to do controlled burns to prevent larger catastrophic forest fires, but it does affect our air quality. And so those are our worst days, is when we have controlled burns just south of us here and the wind blows it into our area.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, that's helpful to understand, especially the specific air quality issues that you're experiencing, in southern Utah. Um,
Right.
Another big concern that the tech industry and the people working in tech industry brought up was education. It was in one of the top five. It's not only because we have kids and they attend public school and all of that, but also it's our future workforce.
Right.
And one of the biggest challenges that employers are having in this very tight labor market is having enough of these students graduate with tech skills, and it doesn't even, they don't, not everybody has to be an engineer. It can be, product managers, it can be customer support managers and marketing people to fill these jobs. And one specific thing, we met with a bunch of you've got this amazing, area of Tech Ridge that's being built in St. George. And a fantastic feeder school like Utah Tech University. But what are the things that you think that the state should be doing when it comes to education to help fill these job gaps?
Yeah. No, I'm a huge supporter of education. And my wife is a retired school teacher. She taught for 30 years in public schools, well, public and private schools. And, my kids have all gone through the public university system here in Utah. And so I have kids from each university. My son graduated from Dixie State, and my daughter graduated from SUU, and my other daughter graduated from Utah State. And now she's getting her advanced degree at U of U. So I think we've covered the bases.
Yeah.
My wife and I graduated from BYU, and none of our kids did that. But and so on in response to your question, I think we absolutely need to have the right kind of education mix in our primary and secondary schools, where they have opportunities to either be prepared to go to university or start headed for an applied technology degree. I don't think everybody needs a bachelor's degree. In fact, here at Dixie Power, probably the majority of our employees don't need a bachelor's degree. We have a lot of member service reps, and we have a lot of linemen, and they come with applied technology degrees. So I'm very supportive of, like you mentioned, Tech Ridge. Up there is also Dixie Applied Technology College. And we get our IT folks from there, and they're looking at creating a lineman school there. Right now, most of our linemen get trained at the Northwest Lineman College in Idaho, which is a great training place. And there's also some of that in the Salt Lake Community College. They have a lineman school, which that's where we hire our linemen. And if we had one here at DXATC, that would be wonderful. So I think we do need to prepare our kids, or in my case now it'll be grandkids, to hold real jobs. And I think that's a university or a tech school's job, is to give them the tools they need. And I think the legislature has a primary role in funding that. And I'm very supportive of that.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Um, so, talking about St. George and Tech Ridge, another big concern, and this is impacting all parts of the state, is housing that's affordable. Housing is it's very tight. There's not enough inventory, but costs have gone up so significantly that when I graduated from college and it was possible for me to buy a home, it's not possible for many of these people. St. George is little bit unique because one of the issues with growing demand of housing also means growing demand for water, and with some of the environmental issues and things like that, there just isn't enough. We're experiencing a statewide drought like we've never seen before. Um, what do you think the state should, what are some of your ideas on how the state could address this?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there, right? Is housing costs and also water
Hmm.
issues. So help me remember to talk about both of
Yes, yes, great. So yeah,
them.
let's start with housing.
Yeah, well, so housing, housing is a function of all of the inputs into the housing. Well, and also there's a supply and a demand issue, right? So St. George was kind of an island of of being open during this recently passed pandemic. And so as people were shut down in other states and other part of this state, St. George was never shut down. And so people from all over the region are wanting to move here because they like the atmosphere here. And I don't blame them. I mean, I moved here 28 years ago and I did that on purpose because I wanted to live here. So there is a supply and a demand issue that we have. So we have a lot of people building homes as fast as they can. Of course, the hyperinflation doesn't help prices. And with the diminished workforce, right, as we have us baby boomers retiring out of the workforce, those are, and several generations, several years of baby boomers retiring at the same time because of the COVID pandemic, we haven't been able to backfill that with our much smaller millennial and Gen Z generations who are much smaller groups and still only coming in 1 year at a time. So we have this labor crunch, but we also have a materials problem. And some of the biggest material shortage is in lumber. And a lot of our lumber comes from federal leases, and it doesn't help. In fact, it's been very problematic that the federal government has canceled lumber leases and made lumber short of supply and more expensive. And I think that's a real problem because as you leave too many trees per acre in the forests, then the forests become weak because the watershed can't support that many trees, which then makes them susceptible to beetles. And without the appropriate moisture, the trees can't push the beetles out. They don't have enough sap. And then we have these big dead forests that are just waiting to burn down the next lightning storm.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a real problem. I think we need to fix the supply issue with lumber at the same time that fixes our forest management problem.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's very key. Also, there are in Utah, right, we have a real shortage of buildable property because the federal government owns a majority of the state. Like in Washington County, it's 70%.
Right. Uh-huh.
And so where we have an absentee landlord who is just holding property and doing nothing with it, and obstructing growth and development, I think that creates an extra problem. And I think the federal government needs to be more rational about what properties are worth protecting, certainly national forests and national monuments,
Right.
national parks, but not just generic BLM ground, some of which is inside city limits.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so,
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I'm not talking about tortoise reserves. I'm talking
Right.
about, or even poppy reserves. I'm just talking about fallow ground that's doing nothing.
Yeah.
That could easily be disposed of by the BLM, which was its original charter, was to sell surplus federal properties. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I think that would, rationalizing property ownership in the county from
Mm-hmm.
federal government to private would go a long ways towards helping the supply side of the supply demand equation.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as the federal government borrows too much money or prints too much money, that doesn't help inflation, or that fuels inflation, which doesn't help the interest rates.
Right.
So I see young folks trying to get into houses as interest rates are climbing. I
Right.
see that as a big challenge for them. And so
Mm-hmm.
we need to, now that's a federal issue, but we need to rein in federal spending. And I think, I don't know how much the state has to do with that, but we certainly can talk about it and should be
Sure.
talking about it.
Yeah.
And
Right.
then relative to the water, oh, and let me
Yeah.
throw one other
Yeah.
issue in between. So there's the housing, right? Housing and property. We talked about lumber and land. Also, there has to be energy supply, right? If there's no
Right.
energy supply, and that's my day job here as the chief engineer at Dixie Power, is planning the electrical supply and making sure that I have power lines and substations and generators in place well before all the new homes flip the switches, so
Mm-hmm.
that when they do flip the switch, the lights come on.
Mm-hmm.
And so also we need to do the same thing with water. So uh,
Yeah, let
I,
me frame the question
okay,
before you jump in. So, something new that I learned last week was the fact that St. George does not have irrigation, and so a lot of the culinary water is used, for watering grass and everything like that. Um, and that if there are ways to get irrigation or have secondary water, would that allow for more development of houses and more people to move into St. George? You guys are a hot spot, you're very hot, anyway, so the water is absolutely necessary for a
yeah,
thriving
yeah,
population.
no, and excellent question. So um, what the Washington County Water Conservancy District is doing, and here in Washington County, the Water Conservancy District develops all of the water resource in the county and then resells the water to the municipalities, who then
Hmm.
retail the water to the homes. But the
Hmm.
Water Conservancy District is now developing what they have, reuse water. So not a lot of secondary water. There is some in the small areas where they have some irrigation ditches that they can then use for um, irrigating landscapes. But in the larger communities, St. George, Washington, Hurricane, Santa Clara, here kind of in the big urban area, suburban maybe area of Washington County, uh, what they're going to now is reuse water. So all of the wastewater gets pumped to the water treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant,
Right.
who has been treating it, and then they get it up to EPA standard, and they have been then putting it in the Virgin River and sending it south.
Hmm.
But now, instead, they're going to recapture that and put it in a reservoir,
Mm.
and then put in a reuse water system for irrigation, because we have a lot of public space like golf courses and things,
Right.
right? Because the whole state wants to come to St. George in the winter and golf.
Hmm.
So, golf courses are a big part of our economy here. And so that reuse water is a big part, is the next step that they're taking to capture, where in other places there may be secondary water. Here, the secondary water that we have is the reuse water.
I
That
see.
there are some new developments who have underground water rights, and the underground water tends, in some of these, tends to be non-potable, and in fact, you
Hmm.
can't even use it for irrigation because it would kill your plants.
Mm.
And so what they're using that in now, they're using that for making water features. So instead of a
Wow.
golf course, maybe they make a big lake that you might
Yeah.
boat on or something. And so at least they can use the water in that way.
Right. Right. So how do you stay cool in St. George? I mean, things are getting hotter. We're getting, we have less rain and less moisture. How do you propose that a community like St. George, with growing populations, which means that there's more people on the roads, how do you guys, deal with that?
Yeah. Well, of course, there are a lot of things we can do around our homes. You need some grass around your home. There's a lot of discussion about reducing lawn size, and I think there's certainly some lawn reductions that can be done to save water. But you need some lawn because having a lawn reflects cool against your house. Having some shade trees is
Yeah.
invaluable in cooling down your home. But the thing that makes St. George habitable, as opposed to our ancestors who just had to live here anyway, is air conditioning.
Mm.
And so I see that as a major responsibility for me professionally as an electrical engineer. Is I've got to keep the lights on and keep adequate supply for people to have air conditioning here.
Mm.
That's the way that you stay cool and the way that you don't die in heat waves. In Europe,
Right.
where they can't afford electricity, you read about a heat wave in France or Germany, and then you read all the poor old folks there died in their apartments because.
Right.
So we've got to not let that happen here in Utah.
Right.
It takes me back to my whole energy security
I
discussion
see.
at the beginning. Is I feel professionally liable to keep the lights on and keep the resource on, especially here in Washington County, where we've got to be able to stay cool in the summer. The other thing that electricity and energy security does, by the way, is all of our water, our potable water that we drink, is pumped.
Hmm.
And those are all electric pumps.
Hmm.
And we have to keep the power on to keep the pumps running, because if the power goes off, the water tanks around the county can only keep the water lines pressurized for just a couple of hours before the water tanks would run dry.
Right.
And then we wouldn't have water. The other thing that the electricity does is pumps sewer. So
Hmm.
you only have some limited amount of flushes after the power goes off. So
Right.
I take that responsibility very seriously.
Okay, perfect. So I have two more questions. One of the bills that came up last year or this last session was HB 60, and this prevented from businesses requiring vaccination of their employees. Tell me what your stance is on that.
Yeah, so I've had a lot of conversations with constituents and businesses about that. And here at Dixie Power, we're a power company. My line guys work with high voltage electricity
Hmm.
lines. They work with them energized because we have to keep the lights on. Now we have to do it safely, and so we have. They work with PPE, which is a term that the whole world knows now.
Yeah.
But in the power business, we've used the term PPE forever, which to us means rubber gloves, insulated gloves, insulated hard hat, and insulated sticks, and things that we work live lines with to keep the lights on and keep our employees safe. And but the key thing though is at the end of the day, when my guys go home and I tell them, I want you to go home safe and intact every day. I don't want you to go home injured or debilitated at all. I want you to come to work healthy. I want you to go home healthy. But at the end of the day, they take off their PPE and go home.
Hmm.
And so with a vaccine, if we were to mandate a vaccine, particularly a an experimental vaccine that's been given emergency uh, clearance to be used because of a pandemic, you don't get to take that off when you go home at night.
Mm.
You know, whatever kind of health hazards there are that might come from that, known or unknown, uh, go with you forever. And so I don't see how a business can mandate a that a employee take a vaccine that is not known to be safe or is still experimental or has emergency clearance when we probably wouldn't expect that same employer to have a lifetime obligation to support that employee medically, right? Most employers provide medical insurance while the employee is working there,
Hmm.
but to take responsibility for that employee forever is not an obligation that any employer is willing to do and wouldn't be able to afford. Even, you know, even the military, who offers some lifetime benefits, is forever reducing those benefits because of costs.
Hmm.
Uh, I witnessed that with my friends who served in the military.
Right,
So I
right.
would be opposed to a vaccine mandate on where a business could mandate that an employee be vaccinated with any kind of particular thing. Here at Dixie Power, we didn't mandate that, and our employees chose individually whether to get vaccinated or not, and I think most of them chose to get vaccinated. But I think the government's responsibility is to provide the information, to provide the research, and to let people choose uh, what they're going to do for themselves and take care of their own health care.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful to understand. And then my last question, as the political climate is very divisive. One of the big things that came up last year is specifically involving, the Southern Utah community was the name change of Dixie State University to Utah Tech University. What did you think of the divisiveness? How do you bring a community together after something like that?
Well, yeah, so those are those. Let me answer both of those. What did I think of the divisiveness? I felt bad about it. I thought that the process with the name change was flawed.
Mm.
Um, I tried to participate in the public, process, and I felt like it it wasn't a legitimate effort to try to get input from the local folks, and that the outcome was predetermined. And I know the folks at the university have confessed that they botched the PR of the name change, and we all wish they had done it differently. And so, if I had been in the state legislature last year, I would not have voted to change the name. I thought that if they're going to change the name, they need to do a better process.
Mm.
So how do you go about healing? I think it was the second
Yeah,
half
the
of the question.
divisiveness that caused, yeah.
Um, I boy, the folks who live here want to change the name back,
Mhm.
and so how do you heal that? I don't know what kind of PR or public outreach you do to heal that. Um, if a vote were held today and I were voting on it, I would vote to change the name back because uh, the, the community is still very raw and tender and insulted, and maybe the university has a way that they're going to win that PR battle, and then
Mm.
maybe it stays Utah Tech. but I'm not a PR person, but I'm interested to see what they do to solve that problem.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's helpful to understand. So I think is there anything else that you would like to include or, say while we're recording this?
Yeah, well, so thanks for taking time to talk to me. I think
Absolutely.
it's all very interesting. And, as you've noticed in our conversation, I'm definitely an electrical engineer and not a politician. So I tend not to give the politically correct answers, but I
That's
try to give
great. Yeah.
the technically correct answers.
Mhm.
And, I've been supportive of, economic and industrial growth here in St. George. I was part of the group that developed the Fort Pierce Industrial Park here in St. George back in 2000. And so I think that's done a lot of work to bring new industry and new jobs here to St. George. And most of them aren't high tech. Most of them are blue collar jobs. And I think we need both. Not all kids are destined for white collar jobs. And that's fine because we need a lot of industry and manufacturing as well.
Yeah,
Don't we all wish we had some more manufacturing here in the US to help us with
absolutely.
supply chain issues, from computer chips to core steel for transformers.
Mhm.
You can't get anything. You can't get electric motors right now,
Mm.
which I think is going to affect our food supply by the end of this year. So I think there are some things we're going to wish we'd done a little different. And I think industry and technology are going to work together to solve those.